To get the Crime Writers on After Show right now, go to patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And on this episode, it was the scandal that took down a president, but it didn't happen all at once. We'll revisit our review of the classic podcast, Slow Burn. Joining me to get that done and more is true crime author, TV journalist, and host of These Are Their Stories podcast, my husband and love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
So, Kevin.
Yeah.
This is a classic episode, but what is coming up on next week's show?
Oh, on next week's show, I should say on Monday, we're going to be having our review of Death and Other Details from Hulu, and we are recording that in front of a live audience at Exeter Lit Fest.
Cool.
So I'm just praying that because we haven't recorded it yet,
that it works,
and that the recording happened, and that we were able to turn it around. And otherwise, we might have
some disaster.
We might have a classic rewind of Slow Burn Season 2
again. All right. Well, looking forward to that. So what are we doing in today's CWO Classic Rewind?
Yeah, so we're going back to December 8th, 2017. And we're going to be doing our review of Leon Neyfak's Slow Burn. I think it's the first time we heard something from Leon. So I think it portended... Is that a word?
Yes, portended.
It portended things to come.
It did. I remember loving the way this podcast started. I believe it started with Martha Mitchell. Yeah.
Right.
And I remember really enjoying our discussion. Little did I know we'd be discussing Leon for years to come.
Yeah. How about we, let's get to it right now.
All right. Now we're going to move on to our feature podcast of the week. It proves that what is old is new again. Slate's Slow Burn, a Watergate podcast, is an historical crime story of a political nature. Leon Neyfak brings us back to the days of Watergate, but the series doesn't rehash the headlines of Nixon's downfall. Slow Burn instead takes a look at interesting stories relegated to footnotes, but that deserve their own retelling. The series doesn't go out of its way to draw lines between the Watergate investigation and today's Russia investigation, but it's not afraid to highlight the occasional parallel between yesterday's news and today's, and between the way we felt yesterday and the way we felt today. Now, as usual, as we're doing on our podcast these days, if you want to skip our detailed, probably spoiler-filled conversation about Slow Burn and just skip to the part where we tell you thumbs up, thumbs down on whether or not you should listen to this new podcast from Slate, you can take a look at the show notes and I will put a timestamp there to where you should skip to. Now, I want to start with a really simple question. I'm going to go around the horn quickly on this because we talk a lot on this show about production value and style. I think the show is cleanly and simply and straightforwardly produced, and I really, really appreciate it. Am I the only one who noticed that on this panel? Toby, do you notice that this show is simply and cleanly and straightforwardly produced and just the way that it should be?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
What about you, Laura? Do you enjoy the way this podcast is put together? Leon Neyfak's narration, use of music, the way they used audio. Do you think it's clean, simple, and beautiful? Or is that something that only I notice?
No, I definitely noticed it because it's something that I think listening to as many podcasts as we do, you definitely pick up on it when there's a podcast that you're like, oh, okay, these people are doing it right.
Now, so Kevin, you know this is a subject dear to my heart because a lot of journalism outlets put out a lot of these shows. Mm-hmm. And this one is a difficult story to tell because it all happens in the early 1970s.
Right.
And so we're talking about historical tape. We're talking about narration of events that they have to make a decision like, does the audience already know this or don't they already know this? And I think this podcast in its narration and its production style and its use of sound is doing a good job being straightforward about what they assume we know, what they think we don't know. And I think Leon Neyfak in particular is writing himself really well as a narrator in the story. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think back, every day when I was in a newsroom, my thing that when I was news director, I would say to the staff is, if you can't tell me something new, tell me something I don't know. Mm-hmm. And so there's really nothing new to talk about with Watergate. So the idea that instead of like we're going down and doing the Ken Burns Civil War version to find these stories that have been lost to history, these tangents, and building something out of them, I think is a great way to go, because it's drawing the picture from the outside in instead of the inside out. And I also think one of the things I think it's designed for, and he says so. Is it Leon?
Leon Neyfakh, yeah.
That's how you say his last name?
Neyfakh, yeah. I only insider information. There's a reason I know that. Leon Neyfakh is somebody I booked probably 4 dozen times on the public radio talk show I used to work on. He's been a longtime reporter. He's worked at Slate for a while, and he's always written and done very interesting things. And we used to book him a lot. So that's how I know how to pronounce his name, Leon Neyfakh, yeah.
All right. And you can say Neyfakh on public radio and not get beeped? Okay.
It's
just
not Ney.
I'm just saying it's a hair away. I forgot what the Neyfakh I was going to say.
Well, how about we get into the story then?
All right.
The story starts in an interesting place. The first episode centers on Martha Mitchell. She is the wife of the Attorney General during the Nixon administration, John Mitchell, and she is painted as this media savvy, regular talk show appearing socialite, Washington, D.C. wife who enjoyed gossiping with reporters and talk show hosts about life in D.C. And then when the Watergate break-in happens, she knows enough about it to become dangerous to the insiders. And they basically kidnap her and keep her prisoner in a hotel room and inject her with tranquilizers to keep her quiet, especially when she tries to call famous reporter Helen Thomas to tell her story. Laura Bricker, what did you think of Martha as a place to start the story, as the first story to tell in this podcast?
I love Martha. She is like my kind of girl. I love the fact that she was sneaking down the stairs, eavesdropping, and always trying to figure out what was going on. I was like, I could get behind what Martha was trying to do. So I liked it. And I liked that we're starting with somebody that isn't somebody that I was familiar with, but it's definitely kind of a window into what was going on with this story before it actually really broke, and that there were people that were actually sounding the alarm behind the scenes and suspect of what was going on. And I just thought she was such a fun character. I even loved, was it J. Edgar Hoover said, well, she's what did he say? A really fun gal, or whatever he said was just so, she was super swell. I don't know. I just thought it was great. And she was so feisty. But the drugging in the room, I was like, my God, was this like the Scientologist or something? Like, is this where Miscavige's wife is right now?
Oh, my goodness.
But I mean, it was exciting.
So, Toby, I was really interested in the fact that the story started here, right? It didn't start, a year before Watergate happened. It didn't start in the campaign. It didn't start setting up the story, reminding us what we know or what the narrator thinks we know. It just starts with this woman and drops us in. What do you think of this technique to sort of start a story, to drop us with a character in a situation like this? Did it work for you?
I think, and they talk about it a little bit in the episode, which is that taking a look at if you were living at the time, did you have the sense that this was like democracy in crisis? Obviously the Watergate hearings people did, but leading up into that, what does that seem like? I mean, Watergate is such, in hindsight, I know I'm the oldest of us and I was too young to really be following it day to day. So in hindsight, you kind of have this story that you know a certain amount about or you don't know that much about, but it's like this narrative that starts with the break-ins and then on and on and on and revelations and the missing minutes and all this stuff. But that's not really the way it was, right? There's all these different things that are going on. And that comes up in the second episode too. So that it's not this sort of totally linear narrative. There's these different aspects that tie in different ways. And so, I think it set the tone really well in that you listen to the whole thing and it really, you realize that what you're not getting is a recitation of the story.
Yeah, it's not a podcast version of All the President's Men. Right.
Right. You're getting all these different windows into what happened, but not necessarily, and who knows how it's going to go. But it's sort of more of a mosaic than a movie.
Right. Now, one of the things that really interested me, Kevin, was now there have only been 2 episodes so far as of this podcast airing. But during this Martha episode, Leon talks about if we were living through Watergate, would we know it?
Yeah.
And he interviews Dick Cavett, and there are people who were on the Dick Cavett show talking about how they're addicted, and this is back then, in the period.
Gore Vidal, I think.
Gore Vidal, talking about how they're addicted to Watergate. They're addicted, and they're glued to their TVs every night just to get the latest news on Watergate. And I don't think it's unusual for America today and for even us in this house that every night we turn on the nightly news to get the latest.
Yeah.
What's happening on this investigation?
But also remember, okay, now you're the exception to the rule. You work in a newsroom right now, so you're getting up to the date information. But like in the 70s, we didn't have smartphones and an information infrastructure
it was a slow burn.
that could pump stuff throughout the day. You really did have to wait until 6:30 rolled around to find out what happened, and it would be a shocker. I do think like they have like two really great founding principles of this podcast, and one is to ask the question, as you said, if we were living through a Watergate, would we know it?
Right.
Would we know that we are the toad in the in the boiling pot?
The frog
in the point. Yeah. In my version, it's a toad. Whatever. Yeah. Yes.
Yummy.
Yeah. Someone said, would you recognize the devil if you saw him? Not the one with the pointy tail, but the good-looking one who looks slick and smart talking. The Kevin Flynn one, the one that tells you everything you want to hear. Would you know him if you actually saw him? And the other one, the point is that it said this is for the people whose reference to Watergate is only All the President's Men.
That's
movie.
me.
Yeah.
That's me. That is my window.
Me.
I was born in 1973.
Yeah.
Like, I have no memory of Watergate except for what I know from All the President's Men and from learning about it in high school. Like, that's it. So what we're not getting then is these were the motives of the bad actors. That was this. That we're getting we may, but I think we're getting more is like the what happened, but from a different perspective, like from people who were addicted to it at the time, the Gore Vidals, for instance, they were paying attention to the Martha Mitchell story. They were paying attention to the Wright-Patman story in a way that history has not. And he makes that point, I think, so beautifully. And this is what I'm loving about the show. It's just the quality of the narrative writing, which is something that we talk about when we hear it and we ignore it when we don't, or we shit on it when it's bad. Like the narrative writing, when the narrative writing is when a host is talking and they are writing for themselves to talk, right? So there is a balance between doing narrative writing. You have to forward exposition, give the audience information, but you also have to impart to some extent why it is you're giving them the information that you're giving them. I think the gold standard in narrative podcast writing is the This American Life team. I think the narrative expositional writing in Serial season 1 and season 2 and in S-Town and in almost every episode of This American Life with those producers is the best of the best. I think the thing that he does in this Martha episode where he talks about Martha and draws a comparison between her and Anthony Scaramucci. And he says, the reason she reminds me of him isn't because she's anything like him, but it's because he was White House communication director for 10 days and she was in the news for a super short period of time. And during the period of time where Scaramucci was in the news, he was all everyone could talk about. And then he was just gone. And he said the same thing about Martha. And to me, that is like a great piece of expositional writing. I don't know. To me, that's what makes this better than it could have been, like by a lot of degrees. So let's move on to sort of the parallels between the past and the present that the podcast is drawing, because I think that this podcast may not have hit and may not have been resonant. Oh, I don't know. 18 months ago. What do you think, Laura? Do you think that that this works because of when it's being produced in addition to what they're producing?
I do. Not to get super political, but I'm one who's like stopped turning on the news because I'm like, I just can't take it anymore. But I do think that there's some definite parallels to what's going on, to put it mildly. And, it kind of gives me a little bit of hope in a way when you hear some of the comparisons that are being made and that eventually things that are going on are going to be outed. But I think that it's definitely for those of us that are living in the current time who weren't old enough or alive when Watergate was happening. Really interesting to go back and look at it from those early stages through the eyes of these people who weren't necessarily what you would have thought of as like the key players, but people that were connected to what was happening.
I was really interested in thinking about you a lot, Toby, during the Wright-Patman episode, because this is an episode about a congressman in Texas. He's like the head of the banking committee. And he basically thinks he might know what's going on. He tries to basically uncover the whole Watergate cover-up, and he's thwarted by presidential overreach. I don't think it's a stretch to say that. But the story of this guy who's a complicated character, Leon just drops the detail like quickly that he was a segregationist. He's a Democrat from Texas. He's trying to do this thing. And I think about the way that you talk about characters put in positions where they're trying to accomplish something, and it's either interesting or it isn't. So I don't know why I guess I was thinking about you so much, but I thought about the whole Wright-Patman episode as something that like you might sort of see that way, as a character in a situation who's trying to accomplish something and being thwarted. I'd love to know just your thoughts on the episode 2 of this podcast.
I think there's a bunch of things, one of which is he's an interesting character himself in that he's sort of a, what does he call him, like that period's Elizabeth Warren. But at the same time, he was a segregationist. I'm sure considers himself a conservative. Like, I guess we don't really, well, who knows what happens in the Senate in Alabama, but we don't have any like dyed-in-the-wool segregationists anymore, I don't think, in our... He's from a different era, you know, and when I was reading Nixonland, you know, it's one of the things that kind of pops out at you is it was more complicated the way the politics went down, in that you had these extremely conservative Democrats in the South. And this is when the South was still sort of shaking out after the Civil Rights Act. Conservatives became Republicans instead of as they were historically Democrats down there. And then you also had like quite liberal Republicans, especially in the Northeast. So a guy like Lowell Weicker from Connecticut. So it's a much different, it's a much more complicated. You can't just look at, say, Republican, conservative, Democrat, liberal,
right,
to certain degrees, right? So there was that. You know, Congress has got such weird jurisdictions, right? So this was his opportunity to look into something that he had oversight over and knowledge about that he thought might be the key to all this. But this was like the one place where he could really do that. And obviously he was thwarted, and they give some like conjecture about why particularly some Democrats voted against going forward with the investigation, which I thought was pretty interesting as well.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a good, in some sense, sort of noir story in that it's a guy who's on a mission and just gets chewed up by the system.
Yeah. And he also, I think one of the things that's interesting about the way that plays out, Kevin, is that, and this is something that's sort of like reflected, I think, in what's going on today is what we talk about politicians, you know, as being hypocritical, right? Because Leon, I think, does a good job laying out that like the committee, it basically came down whether or not they would subpoena all these people in the Watergate investigation. And as it turns out, Patman wanted to subpoena all the right people, the people who would later be proven to be like the super bad guys in the whole Watergate story. And he had all their names and he had drafted the subpoena, and all he had to do was get the committee, which, by the way, his party was the majority on the committee, to vote yes on this subpoena. And then Nixon, of course, was able to get all these people to not vote by blackmailing them, essentially was what's implied. But like, they come out with this reason why, no, we believe in his due process rights. And so all of a sudden, all these like people who have all these other reasons for not wanting to do it because they're being blackmailed or talking about due process. It's reminiscent of the political discourse now. We talk about hypocrisy. We talk about politicians talking out of one side and then the other. And this is a very concrete example. And it's narratively, it makes sense in this podcast. Don't you think?
The one thing about that story is it sort of reminded me of it's too close to the election to do this, and this legal proceeding would politicize it. And I'm thinking of James Comey sitting at home listening with one earbud in right now going, oh, really? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, just it's an interesting look not only at like people who are no longer here, but at a political process that is also, a part of antiquity.
Yeah.
As well as a political scandal.
Well, talking about antiquity, Kevin, how much of this podcast is about nostalgia for you? Period nostalgia, looking back at that time in American culture.
Oh, yeah. I'm thinking back to when I was 2, and I was just like...
No, I'm talking
so
about
nostalgic.
I'm talking about
for having 3 channels on television.
I'm talking about like Mad Men style pop culture.
Well, no, I actually
nostalgia.
very much enjoy archival tape, and that stuff I really do like. There's a danger for all nonfiction writers, which is that you can fall in love with your research and like really get hung up on, if you're writing a historical romance, really get hung up on how many buttons were on corsets in the 1800s versus the 1700s. And then your writing sort of like goes into those kinds of details and it loses the narrative. And you, like I said, you fall in love with the research. And this is one where he sort of allows you to fall in love with those smaller details and make stories out of those.
Right.
Because we know what the main story is. It's like the same reason you can have a farcical comedy based on Hamlet with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, because you know what happens in Hamlet. We're gonna we're gonna look at this little thing over here.
Right.
So it's the same kind of thing. We're taking a big story that we know, and we're just gonna let it run, and we're gonna play on the sides with these other things that you hadn't heard of, and that's what's gonna drive your enjoyment and your knowledge.
I'm so glad that you said that, because all I can think about when listening to this show is all the stuff you always want to include in our books that our editor tells you to cut. Because you love learning what movie was playing at the movie theater when the suspect went to the movies. You love learning what kind of car one of the...
Oh, you're talking about little details. Those are different.
Stuff, but
I dig for that stuff. I think it's important to know that when the serial killer met her victim in the bar room at the Ashworth Hotel on Hampton Beach
True story.
on Valentine's Day, that she ordered a Southern Comfort.
And you knew what song the DJ was playing?
I didn't. No, I knew the DJ.
Yeah, that's right.
I just remember he was too loud. The DJ told me, yeah. I worked with the DJ on radio for years, so I was like, hey, Dan, what was the story? Yeah.
Well, one final thought. Julia from our Facebook group made an interesting point. She was talking about the parallels between then and now, and she said that Watergate played out over months and months as news stories came out. Players were implicated and then finally led to Nixon. It was a slow burn, if you will. And today's 24-hour news cycle, where breaking news drives a lot of speculation, opinion, and stories are breaking so quickly that, I even hesitate. We're taping this on Tuesday night to talk about anything in the news today, because by Friday or Saturday when this drops, it could be a completely different thing.
You may know what those bank records are.
Exactly. And her point is, and I'd love each of your take on this, she talks about the Watergate story as being unifying in a way. I think that you would be hard-pressed to find an American who doesn't see Nixon as a villain, who knows anything about the story, and today's news cycle as being divisive.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really different kind of vibe in terms of where people stand politically and how people just get so entrenched now on one side that it literally wouldn't matter what the person they supported did. They would not change how they felt. Whether that, publicly or not, they wouldn't change. And I think that you're talking about it being unifying. That's the difference, is that we were still at a point where people would say, yeah, this is right and wrong, and this is appropriate and this isn't appropriate, and maybe change, and then feel like, okay, we've done something good, something good has come from what happened in Watergate in terms of it being brought out and the resolution, and now we can move forward. And I think maybe, it sounds like what you're talking about is people felt a little bit more all on the same page when that happened. And I don't necessarily think that we will find ourselves in that same sort of kumbaya moment. Yeah. Regardless of what happens in the future where we are now.
Yeah, Toby, do you think the slow burn leads to less divisiveness and more unification in a time when America was just getting one story at a time, drips, 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 rather than a gush of information every single day?
Well, I think there's a bunch of things that are different now, just in terms of echo chamber opportunities, where you can get your news only sort of confirms your sort of innate biases. I don't know if at the same point, who knows what's going to happen with all this Russia stuff. suppose it does go and he gets impeached or whatever, like at the same point that we are now during Watergate, I don't think there was national unity about Nixon being
a bad guy.
In hindsight, like after hearings and he resigns and it's pretty conclusive what he did, there's more or less unanimity, and so much of sort of the lessons and at least Nixon's personality are so sort of cemented, I think, in the national mind,
right,
that it's hard to look back and say, in 1971 or whatever, how are the lines drawn at that point?
Right. Kevin, what do you think of hearing Nixon say during that Wright Patman episode, it's not the crime that hurts, it's the cover-up that hurts. It's the cover-up. It's so bad.
Yeah. People want to know if their president's a crook. Yeah, no, I mean, again, I think Leanne pointed out, how prescient it was.
Right.
And it caused John Dean to go, see the president, WTF, Mr. President? That was pretty ballsy, huh? I don't know. The times are different. I think the one thing that I sort of am disheartened by is the use of the term fake news.
Right.
And the way that it's used to attack legitimate journalism.
Right.
Because if you don't agree with it, you say it's fake news. And so, I think for Watergate, one of the things that propelled the system and sort of saved what faith there was left in the American system at the time was the fact that the Fourth Estate did its job. It was the watchdog of government, and it stood up to the challenge and what it did for investigative journalism too.
Right.
So I think it's just too easy to dismiss facts that are contrary to what people believe. The echo chamber that Toby talked about. There are some truths we believe to be self-evident, and there are other ones that we think are self-evident, and you'll just yell at somebody in a bar, and they're just never going to believe you.
Yeah, and one of the things that I do
and
love...
you will never believe them.
Right.
It goes both ways.
And one of the things that I do love about, well, first of all, the only thing that can make this podcast better, tipping my hand, is if it were made by the Washington Post. By the way, congratulations to Slate on making this show, because my friends, it's actually my friend, my co-podcaster at Mom and Dad Are Fighting, by the way, is overseeing part of this show. So, congratulations to them. I actually didn't know that he was involved before I watched this. But, the fact that the Washington Post today is, I think, the paper of record for the truth and what's going on right now in all sorts of areas. I mean, a lot of papers and a lot of outlets, including my own, where I work, are doing really the best work, I think, possible right now in this climate. And we're seeing sort of a resurgence of belief in journalism. At the same time, we're seeing the fake news narrative going out. It's a really interesting conversation. But the Washington Post, for anyone who has seen All the President's Men, was the hero of the Watergate story. And I think today is the paper of record for what is happening in America, and just for tracking it and for doing the kind of transparency journalism that we really need, and doing the best, I think, job at combating the fake news narrative.
There was a really interesting video post last week by the Washington Post where you actually, speaking of transparency, got to see a reporter being approached by a woman claiming to be a victim in a sexual assault case.
Yes.
And that was very transparent in terms of the reporter, how they handled the situation. So I completely concur, Rebecca.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that they made that a story. I think other papers were also approached, and the Washington Post did the unusual thing of saying, this was a story we killed, here's why, and let's show you what happened. And so it was a fascinating piece of journalism. It really was. And it was on the level, I think, of the kind of stuff we saw during Watergate. David Farrenhold is the reporter at the Washington Post who's been leading a lot of their coverage in the last couple of years. And man, that's the paper that if you're going to spend 99 cents a month subscribing to something, that's the one I would choose. If it were me. You can subscribe whatever you want, but that's what I would subscribe to. All right, let's go around the horn and give this podcast a review. Thumbs up or thumbs down. Do you recommend to listeners of Crime Writers On that they listen to Slow Burn by Slate Plus? Technically, it's produced by Slate Plus, but it is Slow Burn by Slate. It's available on everywhere you get your podcasts. Laura Bricker, are you enjoying what you've heard so far? Do you plan on continuing to listen? Thumbs up or thumbs down on Slow Burn?
Thumbs up. I am going to keep listening. I love that it's being told through different characters characters, and I can't wait to hear who the next character is. Hopefully a pal of Martha's.
Toby Ball, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down on Slow Burn from Slate?
Yeah, I'm a history major. It's right up my alley. I think it's really well done. Thumbs up.
Same for me. I am enjoying this podcast as much as I enjoyed the top tier podcast we've listened to in this show. I think it is serial level storytelling. I could not be enjoying it anymore, not just for the political intrigue, but for the true crime aspects as well. Like, it's really well done as a true crime podcast. What about you, Kevin?
I'm thumbs up. What's not to love about this?
So, Kevin, you thought this wasted too much time to get to the good stuff?
Yeah, you don't want to waste any time getting to the good stuff. That's why you got to use Factor. Eat stress-free this spring with Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals. Every fresh, never frozen meal is chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So what you can do from Factor is you can order they'll ship the meals right to your house, and you can customize your weekly meal. So you can do it as much or as little as you need. You can pause, you can reschedule if you're going away. You don't have to get it that week. And they have different varieties. You can get a menu that's focused on keto, which I still don't know what that is exactly.
It's
but
like a lot of meat.
Okay. Well, then they also have protein plus.
Okay.
But I just
Sounds
go
like a lot of meat, too.
I just go with chef's choice because I figured the chef knows.
Yeah.
You know what my favorite thing is?
What?
That I've had recently? It was the loaded mashed potatoes with shredded chicken. And you realize which of those ingredients goes first? It's the potatoes, man.
Yes.
But it's fantastic, and I love it because now that we're in spring, 2 minutes is all I can take before I need to have a great meal and then get off to the baseball field.
Head to factormeals.com/CrimeWriters50.
CrimeWriters50.
And use code CrimeWriters50.
CrimeWriters50.
To get 50% off your first month plus 20% off your next month. That's code CrimeWriters50
CrimeWriters50.
at factormeals.com/CrimeWriters50.
CrimeWriters50.
50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box while your subscription is active. So, Kevin, you thought this show could have benefited from better quality sound design?
Yeah, better quality is always better, and that's why I like to shop at Quince.
Ooh, Quince!
Imagine upgrading your wardrobe with luxury essentials at unbeatable prices. Quince is here to transform the way you shop with a range of high-quality items priced within reach. So all Quince items are priced about 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they partner directly with top factories. So you know what they do? They cut out the middleman and pass the savings on to us.
Why are you talking about this and not me? This is literally one of my favorite places to shop.
Okay.
I love Quince.
You know who else loves it? It's Laura Bricker. Laura, tell us about the last thing that you got from Quince.
I got my most favorite new prized possession from Quince. I got this really nice black motorcycle jacket, and I am looking forward to wearing it on my little pink scooter as I drive around Exeter this spring. So far, I've just been wearing it around town, getting many compliments, and it really is buttery soft, real leather. It is fantastic.
Indulge in affordable luxury. Go to quince.com/crime for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns.
Wow.
That's QUINCE.com/crime to get free shipping and 365-day returns. So if it leap year,
Yeah,
that's
right.
You're out of luck.
That's
then.
right. It's clothes that begin with the letter Q, Alex.
Quince.com/crime.
Crime.
Hulu and Disney Plus just got a little closer for Disney Bundle subscribers. Because now, the hottest Hulu movies, shows, and originals are on Disney Plus.
This is chemistry.
Like The Bear, Only Murders in the Building, Abbott Elementary, and of course, Family Guy.
Nothing here but respectful synergy.
Next to your favorites from Disney Plus. For Disney Bundle subscribers, Hulu is now on Disney Plus. Starting at $9.99 a month. All of these and more now streaming. Disney Bundle subscription required. 18 and over only. Select Hulu content available via Disney Plus. Additional content only available via Hulu app. Terms and restrictions apply.
Well, that was interesting, Kevin.
You just pulled a Toby.
I did pull a Toby.
Yeah.
Toby is such a Leon Neyfox stan, is he not?
He is.
Yeah, this is where it all began. What did you think of that discussion?
I thought it was wonderful.
You remember it from 2017?
I had a quick listen just to make sure that it was still on tape.
And then we didn't say anything that would get us in trouble.
Yeah. And although you probably couldn't tell there, I had a really sweet transition into an advertiser that's no longer around. So F them.
That's okay. Hey, listen, we can't make everyone happy
They're
all the
check
time.
cleared, but
That's
they're not
right.
getting a bonus one. So.
That's right. All right. Well, should I end the show now, Kevin?
Why don't you do that?
This show was recorded in the Treehouse Yoga Studio above the Mockingbird Cafe in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi studio, otherwise known as Studio C, the Closet, in our New Hampshire basement, where we also, and this is true, record all the incriminating things we say.
Yeah.
On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you later.
Partners in Crime Media.